All right, getting to the story now that I mentioned earlier regarding screen time. Do you remember that? I was insinuating we were going to get to this.
Yes.
Screen time is linked to lower brain development in preschoolers, MRIs show. This is some new findings. American Academy of Pediatrics recommends that kids have limited screen use due to cognitive and behavioral risks. A new study found an association between excessive screen use and a lower level of brain development amongst preschool-aged children. They took 47 participants' brains and they did this scan, and they had two different groups. There was a survey called Screen Q, and they measured how often these children were in front of screens, and then they looked at the structural integrity and myelination of certain tissue there in the brain. And that's a coating of connections between nerve cells and fatty substance. It insulates the nerve cells and increases the efficiency of signaling. Basically, that's your functionality, Will. That's your... When you're doing that.
That's your snap.
That's your signaling. That's your efficiency. Your brain's just fired right up. So the children with the higher screen Q scores, that's the children who are in front of screens a lot, they also had poorer expressive language and did worse on tests of language processing speed, like rapidly naming objects. So the potential consequence of this is only 47 subjects, by the way. That's not a huge user base to run a test like this. But if there's a real cognitive component here and negative cognitive impact, there is so much development taking place at that stage in a person's life as a preschooler that it's like a snowball effect of, if you don't hit those initial cognitive thresholds, those initial milestones, then you may be limiting the eventual potential for that individual in a number of different categories. If, let's say, something as simple as language processing speed, like naming objects, well, if you are not capable, let's say, of processing language at the same rate as your peers, you may be more inclined to avoid those social circumstances in which recall and processing might be very important to you. Mm-hmm. And now you might become reclusive. Now you might be less likely to seize opportunity. Like, we just can't. There's an incredible domino effect to impacting an individual at such a young age. Now, there's many factors. Obviously, each of these kids has a different parents and environments that they're living in. It's so diverse. This is why you need very large pools of individuals for these types of tests to try to make sure that it is the screen thing that is causing the effect.
Right.
But at least in this study, they seem fairly confident. They say this is the first study to document associations between higher screen use and lower measures of brain structure and skills in preschool-aged kids. That's Dr. John Hutton. He's a pediatrician clinical researcher at Cincinnati Children's Hospital. This is important because the brain is developing the most rapidly in the first 5 years. That's when brains are very plastic and soaking up everything, forming these strong connections that last for life. This is a limited time opportunity that you have that you wouldn't necessarily think about as a 5-year-old. Mm-hmm. You're not sitting there as a 5-year-old saying, yeah, I got to get it in right now. Mm-hmm. You're not saying, whatever I formulate in my brain at the moment has got to last me a lifetime. This is also why we owe a debt of gratitude to our parents, whoever they happen to be. If you're sitting there and you got the connections for life, mm-hmm. you can kind of bank on the fact that a lot of it started super early in the way that you were treated and the opportunities that you had and the books that you read and the conversations that were available to you. And who knows, the wide variety of things that allowed you to develop the way that you did. So anyhow, this is obviously an interesting finding. I know a lot of people were speculating that this might be the case. We all had kind of a feeling in the gut when you would go to the restaurant and some kid is glued to the iPad.
Oh yeah.
You would think to yourself, how often is this person glued to the iPad? And
Right.
you can't help it. You just wonder, what does that mean developmentally? Because it's so new and fresh. I know when we were kids, we watched stuff, but it isn't like it is now. You can't just jump on YouTube Kids and be gone for 12 hours and then wake up and try to figure reality out. We didn't have that option. I told you earlier about the Dark Crystal VHS. I had like 4 movies in my house and a VHS player.
Yeah.
And if I was super lucky, we would rent one. Because you had such limited access, you just wouldn't be doing it all the time. You would do a wider variety of activities. And so we are really running an experiment on the youngsters when it comes to technology.
Yes. And ourselves, for that matter.
And ourselves, for that matter. Even though developmentally we're at a different stage, we might have a better cognitive ability to delineate the different aspects of our life, from technology to reality. But you're right. It's an interesting topic, how we limit this, where we draw the line. They're saying no more than an hour. The World Health Organization, their latest recommendations say kids younger than 1 should have no screen time, while children under 5 should stick to an hour or less. This is so hard, man. Because some people rely on it.
Yes.
Really, really busy people who work long hours, and they get home and they got to cook dinner real quick, and you can throw the iPad in front of the kid, and then all of a sudden, boom, you just generated this time where you would have had to been paying this attention and juggling this whole thing. It's understandable, but I think the investment is worth it. If possible, the investment is worth it in the youth. They got to carry that for a long time, and that's the future of the world in a way.
Yes.
Not in a way. It actually is.
So we were watching TV as kids,
Yes.
right?
No, well, I wasn't really. I did not have cable TV.
Right.
I up until the time I was 5, 6 years old, I actually lived like in a rural situation.
So no screen?
No screen. Just like I said, those few movies, but maybe a movie once a week or something. It was fairly hippie status.
Right.
It was I had, some of the neighbors had farm animals, and I would go, we had a greenhouse. I would go pick tomatoes. It was kind of wild up until a certain point. And then I think around grade 5, if I recall correctly, we were able to convince my parents to bring cable TV into the house. And then we started watching The Simpsons and whatnot.
Yeah.
And then, well, obviously it's been downhill ever since.
But even then, like, I remember those shows or movies just was a lot slower.
Oh,
The pace of it.
interesting. Less addictive.
Yeah, I mean, on YouTube, it's just like seizure fest. It's constant, and you have personal agents. You can interact with the types of videos that you watch nowadays.
Yeah, you're driving it. You just keep going and going and going and clicking and clicking. It's
Yeah,
It's
it
a different
is
thing.
addictive.
It's obviously a new thing, and we're gonna find out more about it. But it's kind of an age-old thing in relationship to moderation. And what's that saying? Everything in moderation except moderation. Is that what?
Including moderation?
Including moderation. There you go. So look, people are critical even of that concept, but you wouldn't, from a nutritional perspective, you wouldn't just feed the individual sugar as a 5-year-old. So why not from a cognitive perspective, don't we treat it the same way? You say you have to eat your vegetables.
Mm-hmm.
Well, maybe the cognitive equivalent of the vegetables is putting the screen down and having a conversation.
Yeah.
So maybe that's,
Tell that to a 5-year-old. It's difficult.
you're talking about the conversation piece?
Yeah.
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 Well, I think they're up for it. In my personal experience, they're up for it. But like everything else, it's a process. You can't just snap your fingers and all of a sudden they're into it. You have to make the case. And it's an ongoing thing, like a lot of things in life.
Yeah.
You got to put the work in. If it's worthwhile, it's going to take some work.
Yeah.